Hello, and welcome to Live from New Amsterdam, a joint production of the New Netherland Institute and the New York Historical Society. I'm Deborah Hamer, the director of the New Netherland Institute, and my guest today is Dr. Nicole Maskiell, an associate professor of history at the University of South Carolina, and the author of Bound by Bondage, Slavery and the Creation of a Northern Gentry, from Cornell University Press, and it came out last year, it's already 2024. It came out 2 years ago. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. So we don't have that much time, so we'll get right into it. Folks, as we're talking, if you do have questions, we do stop at about 12:20 for Q&A from the audience. So feel free to put your questions in the chat as we're talking, and we'll get to them then. So Nicole, you talk a lot in your book about Peter or Petrus Stuyvesant, Petrus being the Latin version. And you really set him, he's this iconic personality that's specifically associated with New Netherland, but you really set him in this broader context. So I'm wondering if you could share with everyone kind of what is Stuyvesant's broader context, and how should we think of him beyond just this, iconic stern figure from New Netherland?
Yeah, well, Petrus Stuyvesant, he obviously was the last Dutch governor, more specifically Director General of the colony of New Netherland. And he does actually still very much remain omnipresent in the history, lore, and geography of New York. It's really, he's part of the origin story of New York. But when I started researching for my book project, his story had rarely intersected in any meaningful way with the story of enslavement, which is excitedly a narrative that is very much changing in recent years. But he was a slaveholder, and as the Dutch West India Company official and leader of the colony during that time, he was actually leading during a time when slaving numbers were on the rise. And he was someone who had administration over large numbers of enslaved people. And the thing that's interesting about his story and his family story more broadly is the thing that really jumped out at me was that this wasn't just a male-centered story about Petrus and his kind of slave-owning male relatives, but also his female relatives. Petrus's sister, Anna Stuyvesant Verlet's family, really uncovered for me the importance of following these female lines and networks. She married the slave trader Nicholas Verlet, who, while stationed in New Amsterdam, managed contacts in the Chesapeake. And her new husband's sister, then, Anna Verlet, married a man in the Chesapeake. So this was kind of a very kind of Baroque family networks, but they're all entwined in this regional culture of slavery. And this was something I didn't expect to find. I really thought I was going to tell a story about Petrus Stuyvesant and his kind of view and actions, and it became a family story, which was really quite enlightening to me.
So, I started off with this question about Stuyvesant just because he's such a well-known figure. Everyone who's probably tuning into the program has heard of Stuyvesant. But he and his family, as you just kind of described it, as people who were operating across these kind of colonial boundaries. He's not the only one who's doing that. So you write about some other families. So, I guess to get across the point that Stuyvesant, even though he's famous, isn't unique in that sense. So maybe who are some other people who are kind of along similar lines?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about. He, as you say, he's working within kind of a culture, a system, where this is the expectation, and this is what the kind of society that they are creating. The other main family I followed was the Livingston family, and I chose them, well, number one, because they have this incredible archive that made their stories over time possible. And of course, they're also equally famous, I would say. Members of this family went on to endow chairs at Yale and Columbia. They were involved in drafting the Declaration of Independence, and they even signed the founding document. And they were even involved in the Louisiana Purchase with France. And this is kind of a way into this family that I came to from the 19th century, because of course the Louisiana Purchase would greatly increase the territory of the new country, and this land would be used to expand slavery westward. And so you've got this New York family that's often associated with kind of their Scottish heritage, but they're also helmed by these powerful Dutch descended women. So that kind of gender part of that was also very interesting to me because we have a lot of evidence for the lives of these women. Alita Schuyler Livingston, who was born in what is now Albany during the Dutch period. And she's trading and acting in her husband's name. And she actually, Robert was her second husband. Her first husband was Nicholas van Rensselaer. Um, and so there's this incredible archive for this family, but this archive also uncovers their deep and abiding commitment to regional enslavement. And it really shows how much they are this kind of enmeshed network of friends, but also family that kind of intermarries and are established during the Dutch period, but then, of course, expands during the 18th century as well.
So and I think this also gets at something you just said, which is that, there's this large Livingston archive. And that's something that helps us tell the story of the Livingstons. But you also, in your book, work really hard to uncover the networks of enslaved people. So can you talk about how this approach that you're using, which is, to study families, works when you try to transfer it over to enslaved people who have obviously left behind fewer records, and often those records are in the voices and from perspective of their white enslavers.
Yeah. So tragically, many of these stories that I follow, they actually, for enslaved people, appear in the criminal, in court cases, in the legal archives. And one of those stories that jumped out to me in my research was a story of a man, an enslaved Black man named Tom, and he was working with a friend named Jack. And Tom was actually enslaved by Robert Livingston. So he lived with Robert and Alita when they were living in Albany as a young couple. They had two young children, Margaret, who was an infant, and their eldest son, John, who was 2 years, or he might have been 1.5 years old at that point. And Tom was actually accused of theft, and reading kind of between the lines, along the bias grain, as Marissa Fuentes says, of the archives, of the court archives, shows that Tom is accused of selling items that are absolutely part of the regional economy. We're talking about rum, tobacco, linens, beavers. This is kind of a shadow economy to the types of things that Robert and Alita are trading at this time. You can tell that he's clearly accompanying Robert Livingston on business trips down to New York City, because during the testimony, it comes out that he's like, no, I got these linens when I was on my business trip, or on this trip alongside Robert Livingston. And in fact, the court actually charges Robert Livingston with a crime as well. So there is this kind of acknowledgement, at least tacitly, that this is something that is a kind of shadow network. The other thing that was very interesting to kind of uncovering the networks of these enslaved people, specifically in this case, was that Tom and his enslaved associate Jack are working with this group of free local Dutch women during the Sunday service. So they're doing this kind of this illicit trading network on the margins of society, and that was really, really fascinating to me as well.
I mean, it certainly adds insult to injury to be doing it during the Sunday service. And just to highlight this, I think this is implicit in what you said, but when we talk about the Stuyvesants and the Livingstons, we're basically talking about this great family, the Stuyvesants of Manhattan and that area, and then the Livingstons, this great family of Albany. So just to highlight that this isn't a story that's just pertinent to like the highly urbanized life of New Amsterdam or New York City, as it would become. This is a story that's colony-wide, and that very clearly, if we could trace it further, we would see it probably linking the two places, as you just said. So, enslaved people are figuring out how to do things and how to work things to their own advantage when possible, wherever they are.
That's right. That's correct. And the other thing that's very interesting in looking at enslaved networks is how much a part of the landscape they know and they are familiar with. We have enslaved people who speak several languages, several indigenous languages, like Kanyankahaka and other Macanao and other indigenous languages, and we've got evidence of that. We have enslaved people who are able to use their knowledge of waterways in order to get away. So this kind of expanse of the networks of enslaved people is one that is really much a New York, like you say, a New York colony story and a kind of regional story that's really was exciting for me to follow.
Yeah, because I mean, I think so many times we forget there's like this fur trade story around Albany, and then there's this like, oh, Manhattan is this, Manhattan is the place that will become New York City that we know, and but really they're so linked together.
Yeah.
So actually, we titled the conversation today, Diana's Child. So can you explain who she is and why she's important? Why did you want to draw attention to her?
Yeah. So much of the stories we tell about colonial America are about kind of people who are in the prime of their life, even if they're enslaved, right? They're adults, generally speaking. And we, a lot of times, for a long time, there was kind of this focus on agency. And so the story of this little girl referred to only as Diana's Child really jumped out at me while I was piecing the story of the Livingston's daughters' lives together in Boston. Um, the Livingston's youngest daughter sends a letter in 1713 to her family requesting that they send a promised child, Diana's child, to serve Miss Alida, and that is her niece, or Alida Livingston's granddaughter, who is also named after her grandmother.
Yeah, it's a
And
classic problem in the Livingston genealogy. Everyone's named Robert and Alida.
everyone's named Robert and Alida. But Miss Alida, this little girl, is actually 12 years old, and she's living in Boston with her family, and she's getting this enslaved girl. Now, usually that's the end of the story, right? You just kind of see these passing remarks. But this story I was able to kind of follow throughout the archives because, shockingly, her father's the little girl's father's reaction actually is preserved in the lines of a capital court case where he is actually under suspicion by Robert of being involved in the murder or potentially wider conspiracy against enslavers on Manor Livingston. So this man named Tom actually murders or attempts to murder his enslaver. It's kind of unclear because his enslaver doesn't die, but he's charged with murder. So there is some kind of ambiguity there. But in the course of this case, this man named Ben, who had actually been a courier and someone who lived very close to the Livingstons and pops up a lot in their correspondence, he's under suspicion. And the man who is being kind of questioned, Tom, tells nothing and basically says, look, Ben didn't say anything, but that he was sorry that you'd sent his daughter to the Vetches in Boston. And so this was for me the first time you really see a father's grief, and the true kind of the full tableau of this family. It's interesting too because the Livingstons are quite meticulous about how they notate children, specifically enslaved children, in Robert Livingston has 4 versions of his will, and you can track these enslaved children growing up through these wills. In the earlier wills, they're referred to as boy, girl, and then in the later wills, they start to get older and they're referred to as man, woman. And Isabel in 1723 is still referred to as a girl. And you can see that the Livingstons follow the convention of children in the adolescent ages. For enslaved people, it's around 15. They start to be called women. So she's probably a little bit younger than 15. So she might have been as young as 5 when she gets sent to Boston. So that kind of shocking. And this is not something that's out of the ordinary. In fact, there's a memorandum where he sends Alida, when she's a little older, at 21 years old, as part of her wedding gift, a little girl named Dina, who is also 5 years old. So there's that very young rupture is also part of the story. So that's why she kind of stayed with me, kind of haunted me in a certain sense. And I wanted to shed light on her story.
Yeah, I mean, it's so heartbreaking to think about, these young children just being separated so cruelly from their families, like this. And, of the way that the Livingstons and others, obviously they're not unique, write about it as if it's just, run of the mill to be
Right,
expected.
regular Tuesday.
Yeah. So something else that's really interesting about your work is that you kind of are able to reframe some events that are not normally connected to slavery, with and show that slavery really is connected to all of the events in New York's kind of colonial history, even when we don't realize it. So just as an example of one of the kind of ways you really changed my thinking about something. You talk a little bit about Leisler's Rebellion in 1689, and how there's actually a slavery connection to that too, even though that's kind of seen as an iconic political event that's mostly for white people, or that mostly concerns the ideas of white people and the conflicts between them. So I'm wondering how you was that something you were that you set out to do, or something that just happened, or how do you think about these things?
This is one of those things, that the joys, I think, of being a historian, because I was not expecting to find that at all. It seemed like pretty straightforwardly about things that were not about enslavement, and so I didn't expect to see anything about it. And so what I kind of fell into it, and kind of looking at the demographics of the sacking of the attack against Schenectady, and that's like one of those iconic watershed moments in this period that really shifts the balance of power in the colony. And I was surprised to find that it had this incredible impact on the enslaved population. And kind of as a background, Schenectady is attacked in February 9th, 1690, by a joint expeditionary force of French and indigenous fighters from Canada. And by the end of the day, most of the houses, in the city are burned to the ground, and most of the livestock slaughtered. 60 of the inhabitants are killed, and additionally, 27 people are captured, while only 2 of the people who are attacking Schenectady actually die. But this moment had a really outsized impact on Schenectady's Black population, who represented like 20% of all victims. I was like, 20%? That's shocking, because they only made up 8% of the population of Albany County in 1687. And that this moment would have been, for an enslaved person, someone would have known, right? Somebody, they would have been affected, and this moment would have been a fissure. You also see people taking this time to run away, and to really escape. And it's not just enslaved people. There are some enslaved, so I'm sorry, some servants who are also doing the same thing. But the idea of the enslaved being in the forests, ready to attack, is something that you see in the letters of a lot of different colonials, from Boston to French communiques. And this is an image that pops up in their correspondence that I was not expecting to find.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing to think about the Schenectady massacre as something that was so deeply felt in the enslaved community, because that is certainly such a classic story about inter-imperial conflicts that affecting these kind of farming people in Schenectady. And
Right.
I mean, so yeah, that's so interesting. I'm gonna ask you one more question, and then we're gonna open up the Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, now's the time to enter them into the Q&A section. Another unique thing about your work is that you really are able to connect the 17th century and the 18th century. So a lot of times when people write about New Netherland, they kind of put a hard stop on it in 1664 or in 1674. So when the English in 1664, the English first conquer New Netherland, and then briefly the Dutch take it back. And so 1674 is considered kind of the real end of New Netherland. That's when the English come back and retake it, and that's the end of the Dutch political control over the colony. So often stories stop, kind of around there. But as we've talked about already, there really are Dutch records that go far into the 18th century. Like, for example, the Livingstons are communicating with one another in Dutch well into the 18th century, and there's many other examples of this. So I'm wondering if you could just talk about, first of all, how you conceptualized your project so that it ended up going into the 18th century as well. But then also, why you think New Netherland is important if we're going to understand the 18th century when the English are in political power.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and one that I had not expected the story to be one that would go into the 18th century, because the kind of commonly accepted thing was that, the Dutch period was so different from what happened. And there were differences. I don't think I don't think it's an overstatement to say that there were differences. But for me, the story was really about following the people. And so many of the people who populate the Dutch period, one of those hard lines, don't just up and move after the English take over the colony. They continue to have a shared history, cultural language, and it's an important part of the way they conceptualize community, religion, family, and enslavement. In fact, even from the names of the slave ships that ply the waters from New York to the Caribbean to Madagascar, they have these Dutch names like the Onkele Philipsa, or diminutive names like Marguerite. All of these things are coming out of the Dutch period, and there's inside jokes from these families who had these communications with one another. Also, enslaved people continue to speak Dutch, right, and continue to speak in kind of this regional language that's influenced not only by Dutch, but by all sorts, of different languages, Bantu languages, and French, and indigenous tongues, like all of these different things. But these are all kind of starting and getting coalesced during this, I think, absolutely a crucial period in the 17th century, when the Dutch ruled the colony that would come to be known as New York.
Yeah. We have a question about an article that was in the New York Times today by Etta Fields Black about Black families recovering more of their lost histories. The questioner says that the person doesn't go back into the 17th century, but I'm just curious about, and I haven't read the article personally, and I'm sure since it came out today, you probably haven't as well. But what do you say to people who are trying to research their Black families that go back into the 17th century? What are some things they can do? What are how do you approach that question? Obviously, when the sources are so scant.
Yeah, in some senses, the 17th century sources can be a resource for people looking for their Black family history, because of the presence of the church records that do show enslaved and free, actually, Black families. And some of these families actually go on to hold land in the community, and obviously stay in the community. I know descendants of these families for hundreds of years. And so in some ways, you can use the records of the Dutch Reformed Church to track that past. Though in other ways, these pasts are very difficult to uncover. And even from a personal standpoint, like, I follow my own family history, and I know my family had some Dutch roots, because my grandfather spoke he had a few Dutch words. And it's only now that I'm thinking of kind of trying to trace that family back. And there are some things that we have in our arsenal that we didn't used to have, and this is kind of a crowdsourcing ability to use these different platforms, though some of them are behind paywalls. But to be able to crowdsource that, I use those techniques. I've gotten so many people kind of reaching out and telling me little hints. I feel like that's the best way of doing it, and just using the tools that we have now in order to try to track as much as you can about your family history. I hope that answered the question.
No, that did. I'm just looking at the next questions. Jim Skirmerhorn, friend of N and I, asks about his ancestor, Simon Skirmerhorn, who owned 2 enslaved men that were killed during the Schenectady massacre. And he's heard some narratives that have them fighting to defend themselves and their enslaver. And that's kind of why they were killed, because they were defending their enslaver. And he asks if you know of any enslaved Schenectadians who were taken captive and brought back to Canada with, I guess, there were white Schenectadians that were brought back as captives to Canada.
Yes, there were enslaved people, at least two enslaved people who were taken captive and brought back to Canada. And of course, Schenectady is part of a larger kind of military movement, right? As part of this, the unrest that was happening during the time period. And you have attacks getting into Maine country, and you have a part of those captives being enslaved people. In fact, their enslavement and capture actually even is part of the narratives of this time period. So you absolutely get enslaved people going as captives, and many of these enslaved people are being brought into Canada, some never to come back, right? They're not traded back, although that is a kind of porous border to a certain extent throughout the time period.
And do we know anything about kind of what happened to them in Canada? Were they just continuing as enslaved people, or were they be able to gain freedom for themselves, or we just don't know enough to know
Yeah,
the answer to
I
that
don't
question?
know. I don't have the full answers
Yeah.
to what happened to them. I would be really interested to know. I do know that there's some incredible work being done by scholars. Amani Whitfield, for example, did work on North to Bondage. So I know that many of these enslaved people who are being traded up into Canada are not getting freedom, right? Canada's not this like
Yeah.
free place.
Yeah,
They're
it's not, yeah, this
still
beacon of,
enslaved.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I think we see the same thing when we talk about loyalists and the revolution, bringing their enslaved people to Canada. Somehow Canada seems like this, you know, everything goes, but obviously not. We have another question that's about Wall Street specifically, and the wall, and whether enslaved people helped or were responsible, or to what extent they built that wall. But I think we could also kind of extend this question more broadly and say, to what extent were enslaved people involved in building building up the infrastructure of New Netherland.
Yeah, we do know that enslaved people were very much involved in building the fortifications, dredging, creating the canals, and their work and many of these enslaved people were owned by the Dutch West India Company, and they pop up in documents. You see Petrus Stappens complaining about their works being stopped by recalcitrant colonists. And so, we do know that their work was absolutely crucial and central to building up the colony, actually building the colony from the ground up. So yes, absolutely, there were enslaved people involved in building the wall, and their bodies, they're specific. And this, of course, is wonderfully argued by Dr. Andrea Musterman, but where they are in space is really important to the geography, right, of the city, of the Dutch city of New Amsterdam.
So I'm going to ask you just one last question, which is if you could tell us anything about what you're working on now, now that your book has come out, any future projects that we should keep an eye out for?
Yes, so my next project is looking at this network of really exciting and interesting women. And I'm looking not only obviously at Dutch women who enslaved people and were connected in that nexus, but also Indigenous and enslaved and free African descendant women. And I'm trying to chart a story that encompasses not just New Netherland, but also how New Netherland is connected to stories that are going on in the Cape Colony now, and at the same time, and tell kind of a global history. There's been global histories told. Most of it is kind of like the pirate, New York as pirate capital. But I want to kind of tell a global history that includes the important role of women, Black, white, Indigenous, mixed race, to this story.
And just for listeners who aren't aware, Nicole referenced the Cape Colony, which is South Africa. And there's been a lot of attempts to to kind of talk about specifically the Cape Colony and New Netherland together, because the Cape Colony is another example of a settler colony, as New Netherland is, whereas some other Dutch locations are less focused on plantations or food production, et cetera, and taking over land. So we'll certainly look forward to that work coming out. That sounds very exciting. Before we go, I just want to make sure everyone who's here is aware that on May 3rd and 4th, the New Netherland Institute and the New York Historical Society will be holding a joint conference that is titled Slavery and the Slave Trade in New Netherland and the Dutch Atlantic World. Nicole will be there with us, as well as Andrea Mosterman that Nicole mentioned, and many, many others, including many scholars actually coming to us from the Netherlands, for which we're very grateful. So the Friday, May 3rd, will be at the Schomburg Center in Harlem, and Saturday, May 4th, will be at the New York Historical Society. You can register for either one day of the conference or for both days of the conference if you go to the New York Historical Society's website and look under the programs tab. You'll find it on May 3rd and 4th. So please join us for that if you'd like to continue the conversation about slavery in New Netherland and the broader regional and global connections. So thank you so much, Nicole, for joining us. And we'll see you all again, hopefully on March 28th, when Russell Shorto will be interviewing Ross Perlin about Language City. So thank you all for joining us.